Donald Trump asked Russia to hack into Hillary Clinton's email.
Ladies and gentlemen, I can assure you that our grand-scale plans will be delivered.
Happy DemsCon Day 3, comrades. Here's what we're Putin in our show tonight. The Democratic Convention is bringing out the big guns here in Philadelphia, even bigger than the past two nights. VP Joe Biden, our boss Mike Bloomberg, Clinton running mate Tim Kaine, and President Barack Obama all taking the stage later this evening in that order. But first, let's talk about the Democratic National Committee's still unfolding espionage saga. The New York Times reported today that U.S. intelligence agencies have told the White House they now have, quote, high confidence that the Russian government was behind the DNC email hack that has embarrassed the Democratic Party and led to no small amount of chaos here during its convention week. For days, Democrats have suggested that Russian authorities are trying to tip the electoral scales in favor of Donald Trump, a theory that President Obama seemed to endorse, or at least encourage, in an interview with the Today Show's Savannah Guthrie.
I think the FBI is still investigating what happened. I know that experts have attributed this to the Russians. What we do know is that the Russians hack our systems, not just government systems, but private systems. But what the motives were in terms of the leaks, all that, I can't say directly. What I do know is that Donald Trump has repeatedly expressed admiration for Vladimir Putin.
It sounds like you're suggesting that Putin might be motivated to prefer Trump in the White House.
Well, I am basing this on what Mr. Trump himself has said, and I think that Trump's gotten pretty favorable coverage back in Russia.
Trump responded to President Obama today during a long press conference in Doral, Florida, where he disavowed any connection to Putin, but then seemed to propose a new project for Russian hackers.
Russia, if you're listening, I hope you're able to find the 30,000 emails that are missing. I think you will probably be rewarded mightily by our press.
That soundbite has become a big flashpoint for Democrats here and around the country all day. This afternoon, the Clinton campaign put out a statement that said, quote, this has to be the first time that a major presidential candidate has actively encouraged a foreign power to conduct espionage against his political opponent. Trump's senior communications advisor, Jason Miller, pushed back. He tweeted out a number of things, including this. To be clear, Mr. Trump did not call on or invite Russia or anyone else to hack Hillary Clinton's emails today. Still, other Republicans have been trying to walk back what Trump said. Newt Gingrich said that Trump was joking when he said that. Vice presidential nominee Mike Pence put out a statement that somewhat changed the campaign stance from what Trump originally said, saying there would be consequences if Russia is indeed interfering in the American election. But Pence also called out Democrats for trying to use this Russia issue as a distraction from what was actually in those DNC emails. So, John, I think there's a lot of fault on both sides here. Who has the upper hand politically in this Cold War of words?
Oh, the Democrats have the upper hand. It seems to me at this point they're on offense and Trump is making dumb mistakes. There's no reason for Trump to be, I mean, you could parse it the way that Jason Miller parsed it, but to the world, the notion that Trump is saying, listen up, Russia, may be a great thing in some way. If you could come up with these Clinton emails, you'd be rewarded. There's no upside for Donald Trump to give ammunition to the Democrats in this moment.
Trump made a huge mistake because he should be condemning Russia in no uncertain terms. They have walked it back. On the other hand, and again, I think what Trump said was ridiculous and the failure to condemn. But the President of the United States is engaged in pure politics for political favors. Democrats have been in the last 2 days suggesting that Trump's position on Putin or his position on NATO suggests that we need to look into some connection between the leaking of these emails and the Trump campaign. There's no evidence of it, and the President of the United States shouldn't be doing that.
There's no evidence of collusion, but it is the case.
But that's what he's trying to suggest, just as the Trump Clinton campaign
It is the case. Yeah, I think what he said was very careful. He said basically it seems like Donald Trump has praised Putin
what does that have to do
on multiple occasions.
What has that
it has to do with what Putin's motives would be to meddle in an American election.
Right, but they're not talking about Putin's motives. The Democrats are trying to suggest there's some collusion. They are. That's what they're doing. And it's hardball politics, and they're welcome to do it. But if our job is to hold both sides accountable, I got to say, both sides have dirty hands on this.
There is. I have not heard anybody suggest collusion.
That's why they're bringing it up.
All I've heard, they're certainly insinuating, but it is the case. The Russians seem to be trying to put their hand on the scale in an American election.
Right.
Vladimir Putin likes Donald Trump.
And
Donald Trump praises Putin.
Sure. And
it
Trump
would be really easy to shut that down for Trump.
Trump should be condemning it. But I'm telling you, the White House is trying to distract from the DNC emails both their lack of security and the content of the emails by creating the notion that we should be looking into whether Trump and Manafort somehow colluded with the Russians. That's what they're doing.
They're doing it, and it would be very easy to shut down. You know what Donald Trump would need to say is condemn Putin in the strongest possible terms.
And he should. And he made both a political and substantive mistake by not doing it. Both sides are behaving badly.
Last night, we heard an unusually restrained, strikingly personal 42-minute speech by former President Bill Clinton about the Democratic nominee, who also happens to be his wife. Tonight, it's the current president's turn to try to live up to colossal expectations that people have for his convention address. Asked in that Today Show interview with Savannah Guthrie what his message will be tonight, President Obama said he will share an optimistic view of where the nation is headed as he pitches his former rival and Secretary of State as overwhelmingly equipped to be the next commander-in-chief. So, Mark, my question for you is, what will, in the view of you and the view of the press more broadly and the party, what will constitute success by Barack Obama tonight?
Well, we were wrong about how Bill Clinton would do. His speech was in some ways underwhelming, in some ways workmanlike, and achieved the goal the campaign had, and maybe they had the right goal. Yep. This arena, the session's underway already, they're on fire for Barack Obama.
Oh, yeah.
You know, even a lot of the Sanders delegates, even ones who are new to politics, like Barack Obama a lot more than they like Hillary Clinton. So he will come in here as in some ways the most unifying figure along with his wife. And I think what he needs to do is what Bill Clinton did for him 4 years ago. He needs to validate the notion that as someone who's been president, he knows what it takes, particularly now given what's going on with Russia on national security.
He's the most important speaker at this convention other than Hillary Clinton, and he has the capacity, as you just said, to perform an incredibly important validating function. And as you just said, the left of the party has a lot of skepticism about Hillary Clinton, maybe even more skepticism about Bill Clinton. But Bill Clinton is almost universally beloved across the spectrum. Barack Obama, I'm sorry, is almost universally beloved among Democrats, left, right, and center right now. Among Democrats.
The thing about Barack Obama, like Michelle Obama, is he knows how to work this convention room. He's not had a bad convention speech.
Correct.
Bill Clinton's now had at least 1.5 by terms of lighting up the room.
Right.
And the other thing about the president is he gets the politics of this moment. He gets the national security moment. And Republicans can equivocate and sort of try to play down President Obama's approval rating. But if his approval rating was 41 or 31, this would be a much tougher speech to give. He is in positive territory. More than half the country approves of the job he's doing.
He's also got the eye of the tiger for two reasons. One of which is like this is his last big, giant political speech of his entire career. Yeah. Other than his farewell address, this will be watched by more people. And the second thing is he remembers 2012 when Bill Clinton overshadowed him. He wants to now return the favor.
Yeah. All right. A little before President Obama speaks, we're going to hear from another occupant of the White House, the Vice President of the United States, Joe Biden. He was on Morning Joe this morning, took a few jabs at Donald J. Trump, and also gave a little glimpse into how he plans to try to help Hillary Clinton on the campaign trail here in Pennsylvania and in other similar states.
My dad used to say, I don't expect the government to solve my problems. I expect to understand my problems. Just understand my problems. And I really, really, honest to God, believe, and I know you do too, give ordinary Americans just an even chance. They can do extraordinary things. And that's not hyperbole. They can do extraordinary things. And what's happened is that there used to be a basic bargain here. And the bargain used to be if I participated in the success of the venture I worked in, I got to participate in the profit. That whole bargain's been broken. The whole corporate culture has changed.
So, John, what will constitute success? What's the Vice President trying to do tonight?
Well, I spent some time with Joe Biden after that this morning, and it's very clear what his instructions are. Hillary Clinton has problems with white, working-class, middle-class voters in the Rust Belt.
Biden Democrats.
Biden Democrats. Biden is well in positive territory. He is here to testify to her as being a champion for those kind of voters and try to say she understands you, maybe not as well as I understand you, but she understands you too, and you should trust her if you trust me. That's what he's going to try to do.
4 years ago at his own nominating convention for re-election, Biden gave an incredible speech, and it got overshadowed because Bill Clinton's speech was so good, President Obama's was, but this is his last big time on the stage. And I think on that particularly, I think he'll probably talk about foreign policy and Trump as well. But I think his big thing, as you says, is economics. And the Clintons and Joe Biden, you know, he could have run. Had he run, I don't know that he would have been the nominee, but he would have impacted the race in a big way.
I think he probably would have made Bernie Sanders the nominee.
He would have impacted the race in a big way. And I think tonight you're going to see him try to say what he's going to try to prove to the Hall and to the country what he believes, which is he's every bit as good a speaker as Bill Clinton.
Sometimes better.
And Barack Obama.
And sometimes better. And look, he too has the eye of the tiger. Again, I talked to him, and you know they told him he can go 12 minutes. I'll bet you $1 million right now. You won't take the bet, but he'll go more than 12 minutes.
Yeah. The other thing about Biden is, you know, he's from Delaware, right? You know, they consider themselves kind of kin. He's originally from Pennsylvania, and for him, this is an attempt to say to the country in a big platform, I get what's going on in America. I've got a fingertip feel, and he is more of a gut politician than Barack Obama is in terms of economics.
100%. All right. Finally, Virginia Senator Tim Kaine will formally accept his nomination as the Democratic candidate for vice president this evening. This morning, earlier, Kaine spoke to a handful of state delegations, including the one from his home state, where he called Donald Trump, quote, a one-man wrecking crew when it comes to international alliances. Kaine's announcement event with Hillary Clinton in Miami last weekend. Mark and I, we were both there. It got rave reviews. So my question for you is, what do we expect to hear from Tim Kaine tonight?
Tim Kaine is a great pick because people think he's qualified. He gets along with Hillary Clinton. He's doing the thing that great running mate picks do, which is they make you better. You know, she's better with him around. He has been virtually invisible. I mean, I'm not sure his name ID is much higher today than it was last week before he was picked because he's been so overshadowed by the convention, by the email flap, and everything else. I think this is his chance, biggest chance he'll get except for the debate, and maybe in some ways bigger than the debate, to show people what he's like. And I think the thing he needs to do is to show why his life story and his life's work actually marries up with what Hillary Clinton wants to do as president. He can reinforce that way because a lot of the issues he's worked on, a lot of the things he's cared about, a lot of his narrative plays into what Hillary Clinton's vision of the office is.
Introduce himself to the country and the party, demonstrate that although he's considered a centrist by some, that his career, his biography is actually quite progressive, the work against housing discrimination. And the third thing is he's going to speak a lot of Spanish tonight. You know, that's a big part of his appeal with that electoral constituency is that he lived in Honduras for a long time. He speaks fluent Spanish. We heard it in Miami a lot. We're going to hear it from this stage a lot tonight too.
Maybe the biggest speech he's given was he once did the Democratic response during the Bush years, and the speech was not considered. The speech was not considered a great success. My question is tonight is, does he find it? He's been emotional during the day. Does he find the ability to sort of have the country fall in love with him a little bit? We shall see. All right, when we come back, there's now some TPP trouble in Clinton world, thanks to a Clinton ally, and we're going to talk more about Donald Trump's press conference this morning, right after this. Welcome back to Philadelphia. The third day of the Democratic Convention has been gavelled in here. The activity's underway. Of course, the big speeches tonight, President Obama, Vice President Biden, and others, just as Team Clinton has started to get the unity train back on track after 2 days. They're dealing now with another big distraction. It started yesterday when one of the Clintons' biggest allies, the governor of Virginia, Terry McAuliffe, told Politico that he thinks that Hillary Clinton, with a few policy tweaks, would support the controversial Trade-Pacific Partnership deal if she became president. This, of course, has been a very tough issue for Clinton. She was for it, then she's become against it. It explains why the campaign has been so quick to react. John Podesta, the chair of the campaign, tweeted last night after McAuliffe's comments were published, quote, "Love Gov. McAuliffe," but he got this one flat wrong. Hillary opposes TPP before and after the election, period, full stop. Other Clinton allies have repudiated McAuliffe as well. Today, though, Donald Trump saw an opening, and he pounced during his press conference in Florida.
Hillary Clinton, because of me, said that TPP was not going to happen. But we all know it is going to happen if she won. Terry McAuliffe said with a wink to a group of people that if Hillary gets in, she's lying and it will happen. And there is nobody closer, I know this for a fact, there is nobody, including her own husband, closer to Hillary Clinton than Terry McAuliffe, okay?
Clinton's campaign continues to try to swat this down. Governor McAuliffe himself went on MSNBC this afternoon to walk back his own self.
When the woman asked me last night, I thought she was asking me, could Hillary Clinton ever support a trade deal? Well, of course she could if it meets her criteria. It doesn't meet her criteria. She is against TPP. She's not going to change her mind on that. Will she down the road do a trade deal that can work? I mean, listen, I'm a governor of a state. I do a lot of export. I do a lot of ag. I like trade deals, but they got to make sense. This one doesn't make sense. Hillary said it doesn't make sense for her. It's not amendable, so I don't see her ever supporting this.
So Tim Kaine's changed to be against TPP. Terry McAuliffe says he didn't mean it. The campaign says Terry's wrong. Is this a problem for her?
It's a problem for her, I think. I think this is a flap, right? It just reinforces the sense, which is the big grand narrative here, and this is the problem. The problem for her is that historically, her husband and she have been for free trade deals. They are now in bad odor, not just in the Democratic Party, but in parts of the Republican Party.
Trade deals.
Trade deals, for all free trade deals. So it reinforces that sense that even if she doesn't sign TPP, that something like TPP is going to be on the table in 2017, and she'll be for that, and I actually believe that's true. And so that's a problem for her, because there's a lot of people who don't like that idea.
Incredible irony. There's no one in American politics who's been more loyal to the Clintons and more invested in their success than Terry McAuliffe. Complete unforced error.
Totally.
But the reality is a lot of Democratic politicians believe in free trade.
Yes.
And
as do a lot of Republican establishmentarians.
As does Bill Clinton.
Yeah.
And so this is a worst possible thing, probably not a long-term problem, but it does allow Donald Trump an opening on an area where he's going to have an upper hand. You know, she's moved left on trade. He needs to have an upper hand on trade to win states like this, Pennsylvania, that he needs to win to get 270.
This is a classic case where the right and left don't matter anymore. Insider, outsider, populist establishment matter, and she, in terms of the politics of this year, she's on the wrong side. She's on the insider establishment side. Over the past couple of days, Democrats, including Bernie Sanders, have been hitting Donald Trump pretty hard on the issue of raising the minimum wage. And over those same past 24 hours, Trump has responded on multiple occasions. Yesterday, in a Fox News interview with Bill O'Reilly, Trump seemed to offer conflicting statements on the issue, saying first that there doesn't need to be a federal minimum wage, but that he also would, quote, leave it and raise it somewhat, landing finally at $10 an hour. Today, at his press conference in Florida, Trump backpedaled a bit as he tried to clear things up.
I would like to raise it to at least $10. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring jobs back to this country so that people can start working again, so that the $10 and the $15 and the numbers you're talking about are going to literally, they're going to be peanuts compared to what people can make in the country.
So, Mark, he then, again, in the press conference again suggested he thinks she should be left to the states. So you know, there's a lot of confusion, at least in my mind, a lot of people's minds, about where Trump actually stands on this. How big a problem is that confusion for him politically?
It's big because, first of all, the press loves the narrative, as they do with any candidate, of can't make up his mind, inconsistent, and Trump has a problem with that, which is a bigger problem now than it was in the nomination fight. But I think the larger issue is, again, if he's going to win, he needs a bucket of economic issues. You've heard this from others. Charlie Black, the veteran Republican consultant who knows Trump well, and others have said he needs 3 or 4 talking points to say, this is where I'm on the economy better than Hillary Clinton.
Yeah.
And if there are things like the minimum wage where in the end he's going to end up where she is, he got to do that cleanly, take it off the table, and move to areas where he can argue he's better.
Right. I come back to the point I was just literally making a second ago, which is insider, outsider, populist establishment. The country is for raising the minimum wage over $10 an hour, and that's the populist position.
Right.
It would be consistent for Trump to be anti-free trade deals, for raising the minimum wage, be pro-worker. I don't get why he's not just out there with it. He doesn't care what the Business Roundtable says or the Chamber of Commerce says. He should just embrace this thing and take it off the table.
Well, and again, he's just going to annoy everybody. He's going to come off to the press as inconsistent, to people who want the minimum wage raised as inconsistent.
Like 80% of the country.
And the business community, I mean, they're going to have to live with him or not. If he's for this, he should just take his position bad. Up next, we got a new battle. It's the battle of potential first daughters. What Chelsea Clinton said about her friend. She's her friend, Ivanka Trump, right after this.
The political world has been watching the dynamics of 2 complicated friendships play out. There is, of course, the history between Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama, which is coming full circle tonight when the president speaks here in Philadelphia. We'll talk about that in a second. But first, the battle of the potential first daughters. Chelsea Clinton called out her pal Ivanka Trump yesterday during a Facebook Live event, saying that her father hasn't put forward any policies that would promote the rights of working women. Mark, was this guy, of course, comes after Ivanka's speech where she made a comment about equal pay. Is this escalation between these two, Ivanka and Chelsea, inevitable?
I think it is. They are friends, and they've tried to stay out of it in terms of, talking about the positive. Ivanka's speech was about her dad and a positive speech. But the level of animus that their parents have towards each other now.
High.
Say again?
It's high.
It's high.
High.
And both families are clannish in a positive way. And I think there was just no way that it wasn't going to escalate. Now, will it escalate more? I don't think so.
I don't think it'll get personal.
Yeah.
I don't think it'll ever get personal between those two. They're both classy.
But personal, to attack, if they go after each other's parents, which Chelsea did,
right?
They start going after each other's parents. You know, it's going to be a different tenor than it's been up until now.
We saw Chelsea go after, shockingly to us, go after Bernie Sanders at their early part of the nomination fight. She will get into this, but I got to say, Ivanka Trump, I thought her speech was great, but she opened the door to this argument because she basically said a bunch of things that are not part of Trump's economic platform that she says she's for. Someone was going to call her out, and I'm a little surprised it was Chelsea, but someone was going to call her out on it.
Yeah, and the other thing is the Bill Clinton did not mention Donald Trump in his speech.
Not a word. Implicitly, it was there.
Yeah, but let's see if that holds, and also. Let's see how the other Trump kids, how Don and Eric do as well. But right now, I think it's on teetering on the edge. Could go either way. All right, another complicated relationship here. This one long chronicled by both of us. This one also on full display tonight. President Obama, of course, here to make the case for the woman who used to be his friend, then rival, then friends again, and now, of course, his would-be successor. So, John, macro sense, the Clinton-Obama relationship, not just the Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama, but the families. Where does that relationship stand on this big night for both of them?
They have always been natural allies in terms of what they believe and natural rivals in terms of their ambitions, which came into sharp contrast in 2008. But politically at this moment, they are as aligned as they could be. Not personally, they're never going to be close. But right now, Barack Obama needs Hillary Clinton to win this election, and Hillary Clinton needs Barack Obama to help her win this election. So I think they're going to be very tight in terms of just the public argument they're making. They're being very tight, starting tonight and all the way through to November.
And what is true about almost all Democrats, I should say, is true about the Obamas and the Clintons, which is nothing unites them as much as the prospect of Donald Trump being president.
Right.
And look, they can talk all they want about their confidence of winning, but they know there's a chance, most of them believe, there's some chance Trump could win. And they're so worried that like some intervening event or some poor performance by Hillary Clinton could lead to what they consider to be unthinkable. So they are arms locked, have a successful convention, and do everything they can through Election Day to keep Trump from winning.
And in some ways, the truth is that Barack Obama in some ways has more at stake in this election, even than Hillary Clinton. She could lose this election. She'd lose the White House. Barack Obama could see his whole legacy obliterated if Republicans control both Senate, House, and the White House. When we come back, a preview of the penultimate night here at the Democratic National Convention when we come back.
Our party has chosen a man to lead us who embodies the best this country has to offer, and that man is John Kerry. John Kerry believes in the constitutional freedoms that have made our country the envy of the world. and he will never sacrifice our basic liberties, nor use faith as a wedge to divide us.
That was in 2004. That was either Barack Obama or his son speaking at the last time a convention that wasn't his own. Incredible speech. Joining us now, Anita Dunn, former White House Communications Director for Barack Obama and a Democratic strategist. How's the convention going so far?
I think the convention program has been amazing. And I think that in terms of doing what a convention really needs to do, which is to kind of tell the story of the candidate and also where the candidate wants to take the country, what kind of country the candidate sees the United States becoming, that the convention has to be considered a great success. We had a low bar to clear after Cleveland last week. I think that bar was cleared about the time we gavelled this open. But the reality is that I think the first two nights have done a great job at really illustrating some basic things about Hillary Clinton that get lost in the give and take of the daily kind of campaign.
Tell me what has gone on in the mind of Barack Obama over this past week as he has geared up to do this speech tonight.
No, I do not know what is going on in the mind of Barack Obama.
Even though you don't know. You do know. You know the man pretty well.
You know, I would say his first focus on this speech tonight is to make the best case he can for why Hillary Clinton should be elected president. I mean, that is very much his focus. It's a focus about why this election is so important and why this candidate should be elected. So that is, and he is someone who stays very, very focused on what is the main issue here. What do I really need to accomplish here? And then, of course, there's also a part of the speech that I think is going to need to address this question about where have we been as a country and where are we going, that, you know, defines this job as one that only Hillary Clinton can fill. So
the lead story, I predict, on all three evening newscasts will not be about Barack Obama or Bill Clinton. It'll be about Russia and what Trump did. We all sit here and try to figure out, was it a success or a failure based on what happens here, how voters receive it. Are voters likely to learn anything about what's happening here at this convention as opposed to what's going on with Vladimir Putin?
I think that voters are hearing plenty about what goes on at this convention. I think everyone's looked at the ratings this week. The ratings have been very encouraging in terms of people really tuning in to hear these speeches. And that's the evening news tonight. But by the morning shows tomorrow, and by the late news tonight, and by what you're going to see on social media, you're going to have some compelling speeches here tonight and some of the party's most compelling speakers.
I want you to go back. You were communications director at a time of peak Trump craziness in the White House, right? I mean, you were around while Donald Trump was assaulting the president and raising the birther issue in the most aggressive way. Just give us like some insight into how that made, what that inspired in the president in terms of how he feels about personally at some level and what he feels about Donald Trump as a Republican nominee.
I think the president, when he got up at the White House Correspondents' Dinner and discussed the birther stuff, did as good a job as anybody ever will at telling the world how he feels about Donald Trump and that issue, okay? I don't think I can really compete with him on that score. And I was gone from the White House then, but I was around for the first round of the birther stuff, which was during the 2008 campaign. Right. And, you know, we were a campaign that prided itself on transparency and putting these things out. You know, I never thought I would have to work on a campaign where we'd have to put somebody's birth certificate, you know, on the web for everyone to look at. And of course, even then, it was the short version, as we all know,
not
also known as the real version.
You're a big Tim Kaine fan, right?
I love Tim Kaine.
So in my experience covering vice presidential picks, they get all excited, they get picked, and then they start to realize that they're number two. You could imagine some people being picked to be on the ticket and then said, hey, you're speaking on the same night as Joe Biden and Barack Obama. Do you think Tim Kaine, over the course of the next few months, is going to chafe at this and fight for more limelight, or that's not his personality?
Oh, I think Tim Kaine walked into this knowing exactly what the job is and embracing the job. He was one of the 3 finalists in 2008. So he had plenty of time back then to think about what it means to give up your own political identity.
But Joe Biden really fought and continues to this day to fight for a big seat at the table.
Well, and I think that Hillary Clinton made it clear that she wants a vice president who has a big seat at the table as well, that she sees this as a governing partner one of the things that I thought was striking on Saturday, I thought she looked terrific. She looked happy. She was natural. Her tone was terrific.
It makes her better.
And you know, it makes her better. And she really likes him.
We all know Tim Kaine has a lot of qualities, some of those you just described. The one quality that is not evident, at least, is the ability to take the wood to someone, right? So does Kaine have the capacity to be an attack dog? Will he be a tough debater against Mike Pence?
You know, Tim Kaine has been elected governor and senator in a genuinely purple state. In 4 years, we might call it a blue state, but now I think we can all kind of still call it a purple state. And those have been very tough elections. Those have not been easy elections, and he's won them. I think my own assessment of Kaine is that he is one of those rare politicians who has the ability to deliver a negative message without sounding negative, and that is, you know, that's an important thing.
Have you seen any data or indications that the Bill Clinton speech played better with real voters outside the hall than it seemed to in the hall, which was relatively subdued while he spoke?
I haven't seen any data on it. You know, that Bill Clinton speech was an interesting speech last night. In many respects, since nobody's ever heard a male spouse make that speech about a female. It had so many of the classic elements of a spouse speech at a convention, and we're all looking at it and saying, oh my gosh, because we haven't heard that speech made about a woman. And I thought it was really interesting, people's different reactions to it, just based on that.
Well, I think it wasn't just that, though. Part of it is because we've seen Bill Clinton be pyrotechnic in many past convention speeches, and he was much more subdued and much more of a surrogate, something he's never really done before, forgetting about the gender dynamics.
So I think that Tim Kaine embraces his role as number two, and I think Bill Clinton is learning his role as a surrogate and a spouse. What he gave last night was in many ways the classic spousal speech. I'm going to tell you a little about our private life. I'm going to tell a few anecdotes. You know, none of the Trumps did last week, by the way, no personal anecdotes. But, you know, the thing about taking Chelsea to college, for example, and how he sat there a mess, and Hillary was going around doing all the unpacking and stuff like that, not only did it ring true, but I thought it was an important moment there.
Tiffany Trump did talk about her dad reading her report cards.
That's a good point.
All right, Anita, thank you.
Thank you.
Appreciate it. Coming up, we're going to invite some of our repertorial colleagues to sit down and join us. More from here at the Democratic National Convention. Third day underway behind us and below us in Philadelphia. And if you're watching us in Washington, D.C., you can now listen to us on the radio at Bloomberg 99.1 FM. We'll be right back.
Tonight, Barack Obama and Joe Biden will speak here at the Wells Fargo Arena in Philadelphia. We're joined now by two reporters who have covered the White House beat. Phil Rucker of the Washington Post and Bloomberg senior White House correspondent Margaret Talev. Margaret,
yes.
What are you looking for tonight?
Well, I mean, we're looking for a few different things. One is for President Obama, of course, to make the most forceful case he can on the merits for Hillary Clinton to assume the nomination. But the other is just the obvious emotional drama of the night. It was 12 years ago to the day that President Obama, young Barack Obama, gave his speech that would launch his career at that convention.
12 years ago to the day.
To the day, and now he's on the other end of it.
Yeah.
And it was, 8 years ago that the Clintons kind of got over it and helped him have the legitimacy, among the establishment to run to become elected president,
yeah.
and now the roles are reversed. So there is an emotional kind of symmetry to the night, but also there's Obama making his case. And I'm also looking for how he'll balance Trump, which is the elephant in the room, against Clinton, which is the case that he wanted to make tonight.
First day was a lot of chaos. Dominated by chaos. Yesterday there was a little bit, but Sanders in the nomination process, I think, put that to rest. Tonight they kind of have a clean shot, right? There's no sense anymore of disruption. They're in control of the whole thing.
I think so. There was a lot of emotion coming in at the beginning of the convention, and I think the Sanders supporters have kind of let the air out of the bag now. This is a chance tonight for Obama and Biden to make a case for what could effectively be a third term, to stay the course, to make a foreign policy and national security case for Hillary Clinton, and I think in particular against Donald Trump.
Is there a feeling in the White House, do you have any sense that what's the stuff that's going on with Russia allows them to amp up, or makes them want to amp up going after Trump hard on this question of national security?
Obama, this is personal for Obama, but again, Obama's very disciplined, and what he was planning to do tonight was to stay away largely from the negative attacks and to stay away from his own resume and to talk about Hillary Clinton. I think Trump has put something in play that he has to deal with, but the way the White House is trying to manage this, at least, is they have sort of planned a limited number of Trump mentions, maybe a half a dozen or so Trump mentions in the speech tonight. Sometimes he changes his mind, sometimes he goes a little off script, but I think they're going to try to keep that minimal for now and then go hard the rest of the week. And let other surrogates, we may see other surrogates tonight. Leon Panetta is someone who I'm looking for, who's going to be speaking
big on national security. Playing behind us is an immemorial video to people connected to the party who passed away. Jack Germond, our longtime colleague, great writer, is married to a longtime DNC official. Got a big applause when he was acknowledged. So that's what you hear behind us.
You got Mark Cuomo right now up there on screen. Going to get a huge applause also. Phil, I guess this question, we were just talking about Tim Kaine. If you're Tim Kaine, this is your big moment in the sun, and yet you're bracketed on one side by Joe Biden and Mike Bloomberg, and on the other side by Barack Obama. You got to be thinking to yourself, where's the spotlight?
Yeah, he'll have a chance. I think a lot of the delegates here want to hear from him. They want to hear his story. There was a lot of momentum out of that event over the weekend in Miami. Kaine gave a great speech, very well received. I think he's going to use this chance to introduce himself. You can expect Biden and Obama to talk about Hillary, so Kaine can talk about himself and explain, why he would be a good governing partner for her, and why he may be a better vice president.
Do you think that there's obviously some corners of the left, there's still some resistance to Kaine and disquiet about his selection? Where does that stand, and what can he do, if anything, to make the party fully embrace him? Well,
they've mostly moved outside of the hall for purposes of the audience tonight, which matters when you're giving a speech, what feedback you're getting in the room. But, here's who the Clinton campaign is looking at for Kaine to impress. Native Spanish speakers who are American citizens now and can vote, Catholics, that includes a lot of white men, and gun control advocates, although she's already making the case, but he will too. The other thing that didn't really strike me until today when I saw him speak to the Virginia delegation, and he started tearing up several times, choking up several times during his remarks, is how much he may end up being like Biden. Maybe probably a little better disciplined, maybe not quite as loquacious, we'll see. Right. But goofy, fun, emotionally vulnerable stories, and he does set her at ease. We all know that because we cover politics. Most people have no idea who Tim Kaine is, and they'll see that tonight.
On what issues would you say they're playing, the Democrats are trying to play offense here?
Tonight, national security. We're going to hear from a number of national security figures, including Leon Panetta, the former defense secretary. I would expect he would go after Trump
CIA
tonight.
too.
Yeah, and CIA, of course, on Russia. I mean, Trump has teed it up. He made this charge a couple hours ago, and I think the Democrats, one after another on stage, are going to try to
Bill
address
Clinton would never have let gun control be such a prominent thing at his convention. He just wouldn't have. I mean, from his Arkansas experience, the issues obviously changed. So between our boss, Mike Bloomberg, speaking tonight, and
Gabby Giffords.
Yeah. How did they see a risk there, or this is all in for the Democrats?
I did some reporting on this week, and the Clinton campaign sees this as a winning issue. They think they can win over suburban moms in Virginia, North Carolina, Ohio with the gun control message.
And Tim Kaine's talked about that.
Yeah, and it's a real sea change in politics here. We've never seen a convention focus on gun control.
The question that we've been talking about this all week is how liberal the convention is and how different it is from Bill Clinton's era. They had illegal immigrants, undocumented workers, if you want to use the proper phrase, up on stage.
Nobody uses that word.
Right, but they've had those people up on stage. I mean, even if you're a party that embraces immigration, doing that seems like a kind of a risky thing to do, especially in the climate that Donald Trump has capitalized on. Are they worried about that at all?
Right now, it seems like this is really a turnout game in their minds. If they can turn out registered Democrats, there are a lot of liberal registered Democrats who may or may not vote. If they can turn them out, they don't need as many in the middle who may or may not. They also, I think, feel a little bit of safety in the idea that Trump is the contrast. If it was someone who was much closer to the center, if it was someone who was much less polarizing, they might be more careful about stuff like this. But he has changed the entire equation on the thinking on this.
Margaret Taleff, Phil Rucker, both touched by genius, and we're happy to have you here always. Up next, we'll compare and contrast the media's coverage of the back-to-back Republican and Democratic conventions with the great Jim Rutenberg right after this quick break.
Back here, third night Democratic convention. Joining us now, Jim Rutenberg, the media columnist for the New York Times. He's working on a new piece coming soon, comparing last week's Trump show in Cleveland to this week's Clinton convention here in Philadelphia. You have Philadelphia roots.
Billy.
Thank you for hosting us.
Thanks for having me.
So two things the media judges pretty regularly about conventions. One is we judge whether the program is organized and it fits kind of the mode. Are they programming prime time well? And the other is logistics. So Cleveland had pretty good logistics, but the program was, let's say, unorthodox, including Monday and Tuesday nights where 10:30 to 11 were just a mess. Here, the logistics are horrendous, Sorry, Philadelphia.
Sorry, I'm upset about it. Yeah.
And but the program has been just sort of textbook video, live guests, celebrities, politicians. So who's doing better?
I mean, I'll start out by saying she is putting on a better television show, a better produced television show. It's almost the show he said he was going to do. There's musical acts. There's, then you have the political star she has that speaks to the state of her party right now, a little different. His, as you said, was totally, at times, like he had dead air, or his stuff ended 20 minutes before the end of prime time, which is crazy. But I don't know if it matters, and I think that's what I'm trying to piece through. But she is running a better
By the
show.
old standards, there's no question the Democrats are more machine-like, even with all the disruptions with the Sanders folks in the first 2 days.
There is, and you know what? She's holding her audience better. Like, her ratings are higher, and that really surprises me.
So what's the argument for why it wouldn't matter? Again, the most striking thing was those first 2 nights. You had Melania Trump, Donald Trump Jr. As soon as they left the stage around 10:30, there was people flooded out of the halls. You had empty seats. It made no sense to me. I asked Paul Manafort about it last week. He gave me an answer that I literally found incomprehensible. So what would be the possible argument that was a smart move, or it didn't matter?
I don't think it was a smart move no matter what, but it might not matter because, again, like this thing we've watched all year where he did get a little bit of a polling bounce out of the convention and all the rules that we apply. So maybe we're going to be overly gun-shy on this stuff, but I'm suspending the rules as I've known them. So he did get a bounce. He's filling the stage. He's filling the air, which we've talked about on your show before. So maybe that formula keeps working. I don't know. But I think smart people in this building obviously say that eventually this is what we're doing. It's going to be better.
The killer thing to me for Trump is the ratings. His speech was not as highly rated as John McCain's. His convention, first night at least. I don't know. Have we seen last night's ratings yet?
Yeah, last night was
Democrats also higher.
Again.
How does Trump explain that?
I know that to him is more important than the polling.
Campaign?
It's funny because the text is on my phone. So Hope Hicks, I'll be in touch.
Okay, because it's sort of impossible, right? We could say, what? I mean, what would the spin be?
I mean, I think today he almost said in his press conference, well, it's such a bunch of platitudes, so it doesn't matter. I mean, I went back in the transcript and I read that as him talking about the convention. It was unclear in the press conference today what he was referring to, but I think that's what they'll say. If the program's not that good, so a lot of people watch. But people watch because they're drawn in and they're watching.
There was some discord and disunity and disharmony in the first 2 days of this convention, especially on Monday.
Right.
In your judgment, watching the way it was covered, do you think the press overplayed it, underplayed it, or basically got it right?
I want to be sensitive to the view among Sanders people that it was undercovered because a lot of things have been undercovered. So maybe I would go a little bit. It was slightly undercovered at the same time. The story of the night wasn't. It did end up being what was on the stage, which speaks to putting on a good convention. Right. You wash it away.
Right. Let's go back to the question of dissemination of information. There's the network ratings, and that's obviously the biggest way to reach people. The Republicans made a big deal after Cleveland of their Facebook video streams and social media overall. My sense is the Democrats are doing a little bit more on local television than the Republicans did, just from walking around the hall. But is there an argument that the Republicans somehow got their message out, Trump style, less through network television, more through social media?
That's always an argument with Trump, anyway, no matter what. And even he's counter-programming this convention, with the exception of his press conference, which is a big deal, on Twitter.
Right.
So, yeah, but you know that the Democrats are probably pumping this out, or we can say it for sure, pumping it out really methodically. And who's our independent voter? And what are they watching? And they know inside their home, and they're using that data. So, this will be the ultimate test of this campaign Trump sees that as dicing and slicing and a bunch of magic.
Right.
But we'll see,
Well, one of the things that we all do here is we do a lot of theater criticism, and we're kind of compelled to do it, and we love to do it. But when will we know, in your judgment, what has worked and what has not worked, and whether these conventions have been successful or not successful relative to one another and in the abstract?
I feel like, and you guys have been at it a little bit longer than I have, but I think I've been at it long enough. You guys are slightly older than I am, I think. But we'll know a couple weeks.
Can we get the bouncer in here to get this guy out of here?
But it takes a couple weeks before you really know, I think, in terms of really lasting change.
What's been the imagery like here that's distinctive to you? Not the speakers, but sort of the symbolism of the stage and the makeup of the of the speakers overall.
I mean, obviously, it's like the big, diverse Democratic Party.
Yeah.
I think the videos have been super well produced. Doesn't matter. I don't, again, we'll see, but they're getting some play on TV.
I think these are the best produced videos I can remember at a convention. I'm not sure again who's seeing them, but they're extraordinarily well produced.
And I expected that in the Trump convention. I thought there was going to be a show, but it was a different kind of show. It was a reality show, and it was a compelling one at that, in its own way.
Philadelphia's best, Jim Rutenberg.
Philly, stick with
man.
us. It's going to win everybody
Where's
over.
the best cheese stick?
I'm a Jim's guy.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Jim. Thank you, Jim Rutenberg.
Right.
John and I will be right back.
Hey.
Some selected excerpts from President Obama's speech are out in a matter of hours. According to the prepared text, President Obama will say, quote, "There has never been a man or a woman more qualified than Hillary Clinton to serve as President of the United States of
Diss
America."
to Thomas Jefferson.
Man, that is a big claim. Check out BloombergPolitics.com for all of our team's convention coverage here in Philadelphia. Coming up on TV, BTV, Bloomberg West. Until tomorrow, from Mark and me, Mark and I, whatever, sayonara.
I'm Mark Crumpton. You're watching Bloomberg West. This is a check of your first word news. Tonight, President Obama will tell the nation and delegates attending the Democratic National Convention why Hillary Clinton, his one-time fierce rival, should succeed him. The White House has released excerpts of the president's speech, which reads in part, quote, "There has never been a man or a woman more qualified than Hillary Clinton to serve as President of the United States of America." Also scheduled to speak tonight, Vice
What is America? We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all of us are created equal.
The Constitution will be colorblind. This is what we're talking about.
And so it began. A glorious idea, a place, a nation where anything is possible.
I have a dream.
But how do you do what has never been done before? Making an idea a reality isn't easy.
I promise you, we as a people will get there.
It happens when everyday heroes find their voices. When you speak your mind, tell others who you are and what you stand for.
When you vote. It happens when you build the American dream, one person at a time.
When we remember that freedom is not our birthright.
We have to work for it.
Die for it, day and night for it.
Every single day, we earn it all over again.
In our America,
we never lose hope.
We never stop looking out for one another.